Chapter 7 How Betty Sherman Won a Husband. The rest of us did not share the Story Girl's enthusiasm regarding our call on Mr. Campbell. We secretly dreaded it. If, as was said, he detested children, who knew what sort of a reception we might meet? Mr. Campbell was a rich, retired farmer who took life easily. He had visited New York and Boston, Toronto and Montreal. He had even been as far as the Pacific coast. Therefore, he was regarded in Carlisle as a much-traveled man, and he was known to be well-read and intelligent. But it was also known that Mr. Campbell was not always in a good humor. If he liked you, there was nothing he would not do for you. If he disliked you, well, you were not left in ignorance of it. In short, we had the impression that Mr. Campbell resembled the famous little girl with a curl in the middle of her forehead. When he was good, he was very, very good, and when he was bad, he was horrid. What if this were one of his horrid days? "He can't do anything to us, you know," said the Story Girl. "He may be rude, but that won't hurt anyone but himself." "Hard words break no bones," observed Felicity philosophically. "But they hurt your feelings. I am afraid of Mr. Campbell," said Cecily candidly. "Perhaps we'd better give up and go home," suggested Dan. "You can go home if you like," said the Story Girl scornfully. "But I am going to see Mr. Campbell. I know I can manage him, but if I have to go alone and he gives me anything, I'll keep it all for my own collection, mind you." That settled it. We were not going to let the Story Girl get ahead of us in the matter of collecting. Mr. Campbell's housekeeper ushered us into his parlor and left us. Presently, Mr. Campbell himself was standing in the doorway, looking us over. We took heart of grace. It seemed to be one of his good days, for there was a quizzical smile on his broad, clean-shaven, strongly featured face. Mr. Campbell was a tall man, with a massive head, well thatched with thick black hair, gray-streaked. He had big black eyes, with many wrinkles around them, and a thin, firm, long-lipped mouth. We thought him handsome for an old man. His gaze wandered over us with an uncomplimentary indifference until it fell on the Story Girl, leaning back in an armchair. She looked like a slender red lily in the unstudied grace of her attitude. A spark flashed into Mr. Campbell's black eyes. "Is this a Sunday school deputation?" he inquired rather ironically. "No, we have come to ask a favor of you," said the Story Girl. The magic of her voice worked its will on Mr. Campbell as on all others. He came in, sat down, hooked his thumb into his vest pocket, and smiled at her. "What is it?" he asked. "We are collecting for our school library, and we have called to ask you for a contribution," she replied. "Why should I contribute to your school library?" demanded Mr. Campbell. This was a poser for us. Why should he, indeed? But the Story Girl was quite equal to it. Leaning forward and throwing an indescribable witchery into tone and eyes and smile, she said, "Because a lady asks you." Mr. Campbell chuckled. "The best of all reasons," he said. "But see here, my dear young lady, I'm an old miser and curmudgeon, as you may have heard. I hate to part with my money, even for a good reason. And I never part with any of it unless I am to receive some benefit from the expenditure. Now, what earthly good could I get from your 3x6 school library? None whatever. But I shall make you a fair offer. I have heard from my housekeeper's urchin of a son that you are a master hand to tell stories. Tell me one, here and now. I shall pay you in proportion to the entertainment you afford me. Come now, and do your prettiest." There was a fine mockery in his tone that put the Story Girl on her mettle instantly. She sprang to her feet, an amazing change coming over her. Her eyes flashed and burned. Crimson spots glowed in her cheeks. "I shall tell you the story of the Sherman girls and how Betty Sherman won a husband," she said. We gasped. Was the Story Girl crazy? Or had she forgotten that Betty Sherman was Mr. Campbell's own great-grandmother, and that her method of winning a husband was not exactly in accordance with maidenly traditions? But Mr. Campbell chuckled again. "An excellent test," he said. "If you can amuse me with that story, you must be a wonder. I've heard it so often that it has no more interest for me than the alphabet." "One cold winter day, 80 years ago," began the Story Girl without further parley, "Donald Fraser was sitting by the window of his new house, playing his fiddle for company, and looking out over the white, frozen bay before his door. It was a bitter, bitter cold, and a storm was brewing. But storm or no storm, Donald meant to go over the bay that evening to see Nancy Sherman. He was thinking of her as he played Annie Laurie, for Nancy was more beautiful than the lady of the song. "Her face, it is the fairest that e'er the sun shone on," hummed Donald. And oh, he thought so too. He did not know whether Nancy cared for him or not. He had many rivals, but he knew that if she would not come to be the mistress of his new house, no one else ever should. So he sat there that afternoon and dreamed of her as he played sweet old songs and rollicking jigs on his fiddle. While he was playing, a sleigh drove up to the door, and Neil Campbell came in. Donald was not overly glad to see him, for he suspected where he was going. Neil Campbell, who was Highland Scotch and lived down at Berwick, was courting Nancy Sherman too, and what was far worse, Nancy's father favored him, because he was a richer man than Donald Fraser. But Donald was not going to show all he thought. Scotch people never do, and he pretended to be very glad to see Neil, and made him heartily welcome. Neil sat down by the roaring fire, looking quite well satisfied with himself. It was 10 miles from Berwick to the bay shore, and a call at a halfway house was just the thing. Then Donald brought out the whiskey. They always did that 80 years ago, you know. If you were a woman, you could give your visitors a dish of tea, but if you were a man and did not offer them a taste of whiskey, you were thought either very mean or very ignorant. "You look cold," said Donald in his great, hearty voice. "Sit nearer the fire, man, and put a bit of warmth in your veins. It's bitter cold the day. And now tell me the Berwick news. Has Jean McLean made up with her man yet? And is it true that Sandy McQuarrie is to marry Kate Ferguson? 'Twill be a match now, sure, with her red hair. Sandy will not be like to lose his bride past finding." Neil had plenty of news to tell, and the more whiskey he drank, the more he told. He didn't notice that Donald was not taking much. Neil talked on, and of course he soon began to tell things it would have been much wiser not to tell. Finally, he told Donald that he was going over the bay to ask Nancy Sherman that very night to marry him, and if she would have him, then Donald and all the folks should see a wedding that was a wedding. Oh, wasn't Donald taken aback? This was more than he had expected. Neil hadn't been courting Nancy very long, and Donald never dreamed he would propose to her quite so soon. At first, Donald didn't know what to do. He felt sure deep down in his heart that Nancy liked him. She was very shy and modest, but you know a girl can let a man see she likes him without going out of her way. But Donald knew that if Neil proposed first, he would have the best chance. Neil was rich, and the Shermans were poor, and old Elias Sherman would have the most to say in the matter. If he told Nancy she must take Neil Campbell, she would never dream of disobeying him. Old Elias Sherman was a man who had to be obeyed. But if Nancy had only promised someone else first, her father would not make her break her word. Wasn't it a hard plight for poor Donald? But he was a Scotchman, you know, and it's pretty hard to stick a Scotchman long. Presently a twinkle came into his eyes, for he remembered that all was fair in love and war. So he said to Neil, oh so persuasively, "Have some more, man, have some more. 'Twill keep the heart in you in the teeth of that wind. Help yourself, there's plenty more where that came from." Neil didn't want much persuasion. He took some more, and said slyly, "Is it going over the bay the night that yourself will be doing?" Donald shook his head. "I had thought of it," he owned, "but it looks a wee like a storm, and my sleigh is at the blacksmith's to be shod. If I went it must be on Black Dan's back, and he likes a canter over the ice in a snowstorm as little as I. His own fireside is the best place for a man tonight, Campbell." Have another taste, man, have another taste." Neil went on tasting, and that sly Donald sat there with a sober face, but laughing eyes, and coaxed him on. At last, Neil's head fell forward on his breast, and he was sound asleep